Hi, my name is Dr. Leah Barlow, and welcome to our new digital home, Space at the Center, where we're going to talk about pop culture mixed with a splash of academia. Now, you may have seen me on other spaces online before. I am a professor in my real life, but I also like to get online and have conversations. And I heard you all talk about how you wanted to have longer discussions, and so that is what we are here for. We're thinking about literature, we're thinking about film, we're thinking about popular television shows. We're going to do all that right here at Space at the Center. Talk with y'all soon.
We want to go ahead and get started. We don't want to hold you all long. We'll be here maybe 30, 45 minutes. Like I said, we're talking about the 13th condemnation of Blackness today. We'll probably talk around the new Jim Crow because I feel like the 13th and the new Jim Crow, sort of go together. But we'll go on ahead and get started. These are just extra classes. You don't have to attend. This is just a little fun, okay? A little extra something, okay? All right, Narelle, do you want to get started first? You want me to get started first? What do you want to do?
You can get started first.
Okay, so I want to start with the condemnation of Blackness. This book was published in 2010. I think I read it in 2015. And to be honest with you, it stuck with me because for the most part, my idea of Blackness and criminality was pretty much tied to the way the 13th talks about it, which is, okay, in the South, you have the 13th Amendment, there's a loophole, Black men and women, for that part, are largely criminalized and forced to be sort of free labor to rebuild the South. And what Khalil Gibran Muhammad says is, wait, no, this is not just, and this is the book, y'all, if you've never seen it. He says, this is not this is not just about a pre-modern South. There's very much a modern North, right, that is also playing into these ideas at that turn of the 20th century. So think the period of industrialization that's playing to these ideas of criminality. And then he adds another layer when he says, why actually don't European immigrant groups have this same sort of criminality when we think about, if you understand, Irish immigration groups, immigrant groups, Polish immigrant groups, Italian immigrant groups were largely criminalized at the turn of the 20th century and very much stereotyped. If you go back and look at many of the images and articles written about these groups, they're quite negative. And so this really stuck out to me for that reason. He also talks about and begins with thinking about the 1890 census as this marker of what we would now call liberal white groups, saying, hey, it's been 25 years since slavery. What are Black people doing now? And they use this 1890 census to say, look, criminal rates among Black folks are high or higher than they should be. Of course, these are tied to racism. And so, and so he goes through that. It was something else I wanted to mention. Oh, what he brings up also, too, is that tying criminality to Black people in particular, to Blackness in particular, also means that we don't get access to the same social reform. Remember, we're in the progressive period, social reforms that other groups are getting, right? And so he says, these debates also inform questions about appropriate levels of African-American access to social and economic infrastructures. So, for example, calls for greater African-American access to public education are challenged by these statistical arguments that education turned Black people into criminals, right? Like that idea that criminality just doesn't mean that it puts you in a prison, but also then that your larger racial group no longer has access to many of these social reforms. And we see that continuing today. And then the last thing I'll say before Narelle goes is just that for me, what Muhammad does that I think is really important is that he says, what are the stories being told about crime during this period? The stories being told about crime and who benefits from that story. And I think thinking about crime and who is a part of that conversation in that way is so generative and completely shifts the ways that we might understand what criminality and Blackness looks like today, okay? All right, Narelle, you go ahead.
Well, so I'll just first say, I don't know if you got this book, but we actually, I think maybe at a Mellon Mays undergraduate fellowship sort of like conference, they gave out this book, and Khalil Gibran Muhammad was then the director of the Schomburg. And so he talked about it. And so, I really remember thinking about him, and I continue to think about him as a great sort of like example of public scholarship, right? Because he had started out being, I think maybe at Deloitte or something like that. Then he went to become a professor. Then he, maybe went to, I think he was in the Midwest and kind of hated it as a professor. And then he bounced back to being at the Schomburg and now, went to Harvard and next he's off to Princeton. But I feel like seeing him toggle back and forth between having these sort of like academic roles as well as, leading the Schomburg is very much, the Schomburg is, if you don't know, New York Public Library, sort of like Africana research arm, an Africana-based library with archives, all of that good stuff. It's said to me that there is a space and a place for you to both sort of be an academic, but sort of like work outside of academia as well. So I just want to say that about Khalil Gibran Muhammad, if people don't know sort of him at all. And then I think in particular, this book for me also really made me think more about sort of like how we understand whiteness, right? Like I think that's something he does differently, and at least at the time that this came out and the time we were reading it within the first 5 years or so after it came out, we really, and this is when we're starting to really get at sort of like how did white people become white people, right? And so part of that, to your point about the Irish and the Italian, is that, they took them off of the census. I think he also makes this really important case for how data can be manipulated, right? I think, at that point, we all are kind of like, well, the numbers are the numbers. The numbers are the numbers, right? Like, you can't argue with numbers, but really, you kind of can argue with numbers. There's so many aspects of them, and you've got to ask, particularly when you've got an academic background, more questions about, okay, well, like, what was the sample size, right? Like, what are the parameters of the study? What are sort of like the, I forget, the control groups, getting really into the sciencey side, right? Like what are the things you have to factor for, right? And so I think him bringing out that kind of way to thinking about sort of like census data and data around criminality and Blackness makes you think, oh, right, like it just isn't Black people are more prone to criminality. There's different ways that things are sort of being shaped. I think he says, and I can't remember what chapter, that they literally remove from the census, right, sort of like Irish and Italian ethnic groups that used to be there, right? And part of this is them being subsumed, right? This is part of their subsumption into whiteness. In particular, I think about I taught a global women's literature class, and I had an older woman student whose background is Italian, but she says, she's, doing some sort of like, family interrogations, found out that actually her family has like I think, I can't remember what it was, if it was sort of like a Middle Eastern background that she didn't know. And she used to think, and she's like, I don't know, middle-aged 50 or so. So I think, she's growing up in the 70s and, her family's making, like hummus, and people are like, that's not quite Italian. But you think before the internet, right? People are just literally making the recipes that their family make. And, your family lived in Sicily, but it turns out they were immigrants who were kind of hiding that, right? So even they had, and particularly too, we forget, she was saying after World War II, there was a push back against even speaking Italian, right? Because you think about after World War II, Italy's the bad guys to the U.S., right? Part of the sort of axes of power. So there's a push away from, Italian background and ethnic background. And so again, I think, and I tell this to my students in my West African Women's Writers class, is that we need to talk more actually about ethnicity. We have this assumption that whiteness is just this, like completely devoid of ethnicity, but really that's what it's become over time, right? That really, if you go back into like, the French Gauls and the Gaelics and all these other European, they too have like an ethnic old world background, but somewhere around the Enlightenment and then coming over to America, those things get left behind for what is developing into whiteness. And I think there's also a question of, doesn't that ultimately kind of leave them alienated too, having separated from kind of like this background? And there's a couple other books I can't think of. I feel like there's one over there about sort of, again, the histories of whiteness and I feel like around maybe like the 2010s, late 2010s, you're starting to get this talk about, maybe we need a white studies and all these kinds of things, because again, it's about like myth making and cultural myth making that's, really interesting, right? We kind of just, again, assume like whiteness is one way or whiteness is just what we see here in the US, but there's so many sort of like moving pieces to it. That's, I think, again, really useful and important to think about, especially as, again, we think about, right, how we've thought about Blackness as, Blackness and whiteness so much in a binary here in the U.S. specifically.
Yeah. So he makes this point to that point where he says the racial project, remembering this is a racial project of making Black people the, quote, thing against which normality, or whiteness, and functionality have been defined was foundational to the making of modern urban America. To construct whiteness, you must construct blackness, and you must continue to share the same narrative of blackness as tied to negative, as pre-modern, as not being a part of the modern state, which, Toni Morrison actually says that Black people are the first modern subjects, if we really want to be true about it, because even though forced to move, to have movement, right, is to then become a modern subject. Remember, we bring over Black Eyed Peas. We bring over the knowledge of how to grow rice. Remember, we bring over watermelon, right? We bring these things over and then reconstitute ourselves in this entirely new setting. But back to what he's saying here, Muhammad is saying here about the racial project. I saw someone in the comments say, to construct whiteness, that's what I just said. Strange to, but that's interesting. Strange to gentrify country music rather than embracing Celtic music. That's interesting. I like that. Okay.
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, again, I think to that point, that makes us again think about the myths of American whiteness, because also I think some of this involves, right, sort of like, okay, what is America, moving away from the old world and building what is American cultural identity and trying to lean into that and lean into specifically a U.S. nation state, right? Very isolationist. And so even when we think about up until recently, there was so much talk about like white cowboys, when in fact, right, there were Black cowboys. But part of that sort of like manifest destiny kind of mythos, you get, I think, this kind of rugged, right, like going out across the land, claiming America kind of narrative, right? And so I think that that's kind of part of it, right? Like they don't want to claim Celtic music because Celtic music is the Scottish, right? They're like, nah, we gotta leave that back in the old world. We're making whatever is like quintessential white American. And so that becomes, right, the sort of like white cowboy, the manifest destiny, those kinds of narratives. And that becomes sort of like the norm. But to the other, I have this book a little bit over there, but to the other point of Toni Morrison, right, and what is it, Playing in the Dark, right, about the ways that the American project is always about, whiteness is always defined in relationship to Blackness, because you've got that specter of the enslaved person, of the Africanist presence, or even thinking about like an indigenous presence, right? They're claiming this land, but there are people who are already there. So there's like this, right? Like they're trying to create this identity, but of course it's got to be in contrast to these people who are already there. They're trying to suppress, to be like, no, we're sort of top of this place, right? We're claiming this for our own and trying to push away what is here, as well as forget what we came from as well, to some extent, right?
Yeah, no, I definitely think that that's what's happening. And Playing in the Dark by Toni Morrison, if you've never read that, please read it. It's not a long read at all. But the conversation is so important in what she's happening. And she's talking in a literary sense, but I think even beyond the literary, right, as we're able to draw it here with this kind of sociological work. The other thing I want to mention, though, that is tied a little bit to the new Jim Crow, is that he talks about how in this progressive era, before we get to the 1920s and 30s, where it's just outright racist, right, is that they're still trying to claim this sort of colorblind universalism, right? Like back to the numbers don't lie. And it's so interesting to me that he points our finger to that late 1800s, early 1900s period as being rooted in that. And then Michelle Alexander comes back, right, and says, no, but that's happening right now. And so I want to pivot a little bit to thinking about the Obama administration, Alexander's work coming out during that time. I think, well, I'll let you go first. What do you think about, because like I said, I want to talk around the new Jim Crow and just the context for, I think it first is published in 2010 and then again in 2012, if I'm correct. What do you think about her being kind of a clarion call in a moment where we're saying, oh, we're in this racial reconciliation because we have a Black family in the White House? What are your thoughts on that?
We're in a moment of racial reconciliation because of the Black family in the White House?
Yeah. Because it felt like she was kind of a voice in the wilderness during that time.
She was, right? It's interesting to see, right, that when she first published the book, right, I think it's 2012, but it could be 2010, I'm not sure. No one is kind of really talking about this. No one is talking about this idea that essentially, right, like, certainly not in a larger public discourse way, right, that essentially these systems of oppression are just shifting, right? They're not really going away. And it's interesting because then in sort of maybe, I don't know, by the time you get to Black Lives Matter, everyone's like, oh, this is the book for us to look and think about this. And now we're coming back into like a white backlash moment where everyone's like, okay, no, we know we need to get back to this colorblind mentality. Like we've erred too far into thinking about issues of race and we're too focused on it. Like, let's pull it back. So I certainly do think that it's interesting that it came about right at the time of Obama, because really people did think, right, this was going to be, but I mean, I think there's always these examples of exceptionalism in the US, and we sort of, and
exceptionalism.
Right. And I think, you know, the US and the history here is they always want to, I mean, maybe a lot of places want to point to examples of exceptionalism to say, oh, there isn't racism, but really those are exceptions, not the rule. And that's sort of like what happens again and again. It's sort of like, you know, trying to get people to fall for that. I mean, when you think about it, right, like what W.E.B. Du Bois is the second ever African-American to get his PhD at Harvard. You know, he was able to do it. I mean, he was able to do it, like the turn of the century. I mean, a time of sort of like, right, segregation, peak racism in the North and the South. I mean, peak is also questionable, but, you know, we think about, you know, this is a rise in lynchings and all those kinds of things. And he gets a doctorate somehow, right? But certainly there's a number of other things at play too. Like so many of the sort of like, what I learned in an academic article, I think maybe the words from Zora Neale Hurston, but actually they were called like the niggerati. Sorry if this offends anyone, like the literati, the Black literati of that era, right? Also sort of are light skinned, have ties to sort of like, you know, European ancestry. And so is that also part of that, maybe that they are kind of close to passing? And so some of that, again, the ways that we think about race now, where we're like, oh, you were Black and you got in, but maybe again, earlier, the 20th century, where you don't have movies and TV and film and all the things that we have now that reinforce to us like phenotypic Blackness and what we think Blackness looks like, right? It's a little bit different. So I think, again, thinking about like exceptionalism, even especially in that era, for me, what I've done a lot of like Francophone and French studies, right? So many African Americans, right, want to go to Paris and want to go to Europe and talk about colorblindness in Europe. And, you know, for African American entertainers who also have some celebrity and, you know, access to privilege, they are having a different experience than maybe those who come from, you know, Black colonies, Black French-owned colonies, right? So there's always that kind of like, I think, exceptionalism that happens where their opportunities are given to Black people who are not directly sort of like in the line of harm or oppression. And essentially, and also as a scapegoat to say, well, look, I'm nice to these Black people. Like, I can't be racist, but really.
You know, it's so funny because I said this. So y'all, I lived in DC for a couple of years. I lived in Philly for some years. If you're from Philly, if you live in Philly, you know, Philly is its own special place. But one of the things that I had said about DC is that, you know, in the South, growing up in the South, you know your racism, right? Like you know where people stand. They're still maybe friends with you to an extent. But in the North, right, you could walk around a neighborhood and every single person will have a Black Lives Matter sign in their yard, but ask them to engage with Black people, right? That is not happening. And I think it was interesting to me to kind of think about, to your point about exceptionalism, where I think I was working in like a nonprofit in Philly at one point, and I had raised an alarm about something they were doing. And what I saw was that, oh yeah, they have the form of kind of this liberal idea, but they're really only interested in the exceptions to the rule, right? And sort of taking the couple that are doing really, really well and putting them on display. And to your point, saying, look, this isn't racism because look, we propped up fill in the blank person. If one can do it, all can do it. Yes. If somebody said microaggression, yes, microaggression is way.
A lot of microaggressions. I mean, I think, too, it's also right about proximities to whiteness. I had an article I wrote for the Griot a while ago about where I went on a date years ago, went on a date with a Black guy, during the pandemic. And he was like, you sound kind of white. And he was like, that was a good thing. And I was like, that's kind of weird, right? I was like, that's a little weird for you to say. And so again, it's about the ways that even for us in internalized racism, we have these, or even just these perceptions of like whiteness being better or closer to superiority or all these different things, right? And so again, I think, and for so long, right, part of, the end of the 20th century, this kind of like debate about respectability politics, right? And the ways that, maybe if you just, mimic whiteness enough or mimic the things that we understand to be whiteness, then they'll be good to you, they'll let you in, all of that kind of stuff. And so certainly that is something that's kind of like always, I think historically always been like intention, right? It's like, okay, maybe, if you get close enough to whiteness, they'll be like, okay, you're an Oreo or whatever, like you can kind of slide in.
In really unique ways. Yeah, one of the things he talks about too is this kind of elitism in Black communities during that time, where you have Black reformers who are saying, hey, we can subsume ourselves into modernity and trying to sort of distance themselves from, new Southern migrants, right? Either that or kind of offer a hand up, but in a very kind of paternalistic way, like you need to dress like this, and you need to do this. And, of course, we know that all is tied to respectability politics. And it's interesting, right? Because you're walking this fine line of trying to both engage with, get money from, whatever the grift of it all, right, during that time as well. And then also you're a part of a community where you're trying to enter into modernity. And so it's a really interesting kind of space to be in.
I think too, right? There's, to your point about getting money, grift, there's also sort of like the capitalistic aspect of it, right? In terms of like, if you think, white Americans own the majority of wealth now, and certainly 100 years ago, there's a feeling of, okay, well, do you have to some extent, navigate, doing the shuck and jive or the tap and dance or all those kinds of things. I mean, even when we think about some of the Harlem Renaissance, key players like Zora Neale Hurston or Langston Hughes, who I think had a falling out over like their benefactress, something good. I can't remember her name, whatever her name is, someone Google it. Again, like the ways constantly we're thinking about the ways that Black art has had to, or at least I am, Black art has had to kind of capitulate to sort of like thinking about a white audience or white market concerns. And then, sometimes gets this pushback of, oh, this isn't for us. And it's sort of like in order to get the funding to get it out to larger audiences or the kind of funding you need, there can be at times that like unfortunate sort of give and take.
Yeah, no, this is true even when we talk about HBCUs, right? Sort of the foundations of HBCUs are white benefactors. And what does that look like? Spike Lee kind of touches on this in School Days, right? Where he, you have various images where Spike Lee is just kind of showing the ways in which, right, administration at that point didn't want to fight back against apartheid. That was the argument at the time. Didn't want them to sort of protest. And so it's really interesting, to think through that. There was something I was going to say, when you brought up the Harlem Renaissance. So I like that Muhammad did this. I really like to say, hey, the Harlem Renaissance has to be thought up against the New Negro movement, right? There's this really great picture that I have in my office, and it's a Marcus Garvey event, and somebody's holding a sign that says the New Negro has no fear. So, of course, New Negro as a concept comes from Elaine Locke, of course, Howard professor at one point. And the idea is that while there's this like literature and art bubbling up in Harlem, there's also this political, sociological, academic side that is happening at the same time, where Black people are coming back after a war, Black men in particular, and are just not responding to racism in the ways that perhaps have gone on in the past. And because there's this bubbling up, you get this kind of mirror effect where you have both your literature happening and your sociological, academic, historical stuff happening as well. And so it's a really, really interesting thing to take a chance to imagine the Harlem Renaissance alongside the New Negro movement. I think that's really important. Can I talk about Kanye West's song New Slaves in a future class? We can have a whole class on Kanye West. That
certainly can be its own thing. But I'll also just say about the New Negro, I recently wrote for shout out Yes Magazine, an article called, the Renaissance Remix, because, right, we're sort of like 100 years since what's supposed to be the pinnacle of the Renaissance. And I feel like when we talk about it, it's too often removed from that historical context of like, the race riots that are happening after World War I across, cities in the U.S. where, Black people are migrating up north, and cities are like, whoa, we had 10 and that was cool, but now there's getting to be too many of you, right, that are pushing back. That, to your point, right, veterans are coming back from Europe, maybe having a different experience of Europe, what have you, and also having fought for country again, African Americans have fought in, every war that the U.S. has had. And in fact, I think it was in this war too that, I think even in the crisis, Du Bois had suggested, like, go ahead, we should, fight for America. But then you come back, right, that sort of like fighting for double victory, fighting for war, fighting for victory abroad and at home, hoping that, again, proving your merit, come back to sort of like violent racism. And we have to realize that the new Negro Renaissance is part of that, like demanding it to see African Americans, Negroes at the time in a new light, as well as, right, this is a time of peak sort of like, Jim Crow imagery that's happening, where you see all of these kind of like, the stereotypical images of sort of like, with the big white teeth, like all of those images. And so there's a way of pushing back against that to say, no, we want to create our own art to show you how we see ourselves,
exactly.
Right? And I think too often it's not understood within this context of like a pushback, right? As well as that it is sort of like global. I think it ends up, for whatever reasons, being remembered as the Harlem Renaissance because so many people went to Harlem. But certainly Alain Locke, right, was in D.C. the whole time.
He was in D.C.
Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston had a moment in D.C. It's also global, right? There's, sort of like the negritude movement that happens in the Francophone countries,
we completely
right?
forget.
Larger...
I was gonna say we completely forget Aimé Césaire. With all Frantz Fanon, right? All of these things that are sort of, well, he's later on, but all of these things that are sort of pouring into these ideas. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. So there's a way that, things in history, things get so kind of like, generalized, watered down, removed from their, political context. And it really is important that we kind of get to, that we get to understand more of that, or understand even too the kind of like in every movement, there's frictions between people, right? That are happening, frictions about gender, about all kinds of things. And it just feels like such a shame that we lose so much nuance. And of course, that is perhaps for reasons. I was just thinking about today before we got on that I was like, it felt like in American history, you always got to 1960 and then things just kind of fell apart. You never really got to hear about what happened. And I don't know if, students are still, spending forever on the Revolutionary War and never getting to 1960. It feels like very possibly, right, that they're again sort of like, because that's the time that you get so many, right, like movements, racial, sexuality, gender, all these kinds of movements pushing back about, pushing really hard against our conceptions of what it means to be American and identity, and even sort of the creation of African American studies departments, gender, women's sexuality departments, in the 80s. And it feels like none of that gets told in high school, right?
Yeah, you all know I used to teach American Studies in high school, and the way that we structured it is it was a year-long course, right? So we had to get to the 60s because in the second half we got to it. But one of the things that I realized, even as I was trying to teach the course, was how much I had to relearn, right? How much I had to teach myself that I had missed in my own sort of understanding of what was happening in American history. Because to your point, we just skip right through. Somebody said, yeah, we skipped right after the Civil War because we ran out of time. Yeah, and that's often what happens, not to mention curriculums that just don't deem it important to have certain conversations. Like I remember when I did a whole series we talked about September 11th, right? And a lot of my students hadn't been born yet, right? And so as we're talking about it, I'm trying to put it in sort of context for them and help them to understand. Many of them, this was their first time even engaging with this in a class, right? They knew it maybe from family kind of mentioned, but they hadn't engaged conversations about what was happening and biases against Muslim communities during that time, right? And why that came up and what that looks like now, right? Had I been teaching the course now, it would have been a great conversation. But yeah, we definitely don't do that. Okay, sadly, history is never told in full due to time constraints or even the educator not knowing. Yes, that is very true. That is very true.
That is true. I have my students sometimes say like, oh, I can't believe you haven't learned this. How come we haven't learned this? And I mean, I think the further you get into being a college professor, I'm like, oh yeah, that's probably because you didn't have a doctorally trained, teacher. Because, some of the stuff I talk about is the history in some of my classes has come up a lot for me is like the history of experimentation on incarcerated people and African Americans. And that is certainly something, right, that isn't just, coming up in classes. And so, they're like, oh, I can't believe I didn't learn this. It's like, yeah, probably because, again, this is really like a specialty in ways. And it's unfortunate, again, that our education system is such that like this is such nuanced, protected information that ultimately, too, depending on how things are going with, federal funding to research institutions, those things might not be, supported ultimately. And certainly as we see with doctoral programs and sort of like the sort of rising cost and all of those kinds of things. Many of these, a lot of this is kind of fracturing, right? The ability to kind of be able to spend, 6, 7, a decade, studying, specific areas is becoming sort of like, not economically feasible for many.
Yeah, I really wonder what the future holds for college in general, let alone doctoral programs. I think that, I don't know if you saw where the University of California system has gotten rid of much of their faculty and replaced it with kind of AI systems. Yeah. And I feel like
Is that?
Go ahead.
Sorry, is that? I think that's Cal State, right?
Cal State.
They have two.
Yes,
I think Cal State has gotten rid of.
Cal State, and it concerns me because I think about even what we're doing now, which our PR person told me was open source teaching. I was like, shout out to you giving us the language, right? Marketing, okay, people. But I found it really interesting that that this has come up and bubbled up at this time, because I think that that's what is going to happen. Education is going to have to look like us streaming on TikTok Live Studio, right? And having these conversations. Somebody said we talk fast. Yeah, we do talk fast. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
This will be recorded and posted to, shout out to our YouTube page, our YouTube channel that we've started, Space at the Center. That's where you see these things. But it's really interesting to me what's happening with education. And I'm not sure what that will look like. And to your point about PhD programs, who has the money or the time to spend 6 to 7 years trying to specialize in a topic that maybe not everybody finds even valuable, right? I knew when I was going into Africana studies, I understood, yes, Space at the Center, that's what it's called on YouTube. I understood when I went into Africana studies that I was going to have to be able to teach American studies. I was going to have to be able to do a certain number of things until I could get that faculty position where I could do what I'm good at and what I know to do. And we can have a whole conversation about the job market, but we'll keep that to the side. But yeah, so those are my thoughts. Now, I wanted to hear your thoughts on the 13th. Do you feel like we kind of touched that? We only have a few more minutes. Do you all want to? Go ahead, Nora.
No, go ahead. You can finish.
No, if you all have any comments that you all wanted to make about the 13th, please leave them. I will read them as we get to them. But go ahead, Nora, what were your thoughts on the 13th?
I was going to say it's interesting, again, thinking about the kind of way that things kind of like swing back and forth, that, when 13th came out, right, it was such a watched documentary. Everyone was talking about it. What was that? Like, was that 2015, 2016?
Yeah.
I showed it to students in my African American literature class. And then it got to the point where, I asked students if they'd seen it. Most of them had seen it. So I was like, okay, I'll stop showing it. Mm-hmm. But now we're getting close to 10 years from that point. I asked students if they've seen it. They're all like, no. I'm like, you haven't seen 13. Right. Well, now I gotta reintegrate it back in. So I teach like a neo-slave narrative class that kind of goes, this most recent version of it, I taught sort of like open understanding of neo-slave narrative. So neo-slave narrative, right, is sort of, slave narratives written by contemporary authors, right, that reimagine this trip from, slavery to freedom. You can think of like Colson Whitehead's Underground Railroad, that was sort of one of the most popular in recent years, also came out in 2016. So around the same time, right, sort of end of Obama era, pushback about race, all of that kind of stuff. But I've most recently also taught books that are sort of like kind of like a different variation of that. So Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah's Chain Gang All-Stars, that it imagines like a near future where incarcerated gladiators have to fight each other to death for freedom. So again, this kind of search for freedom. And there are also, of course, mostly people of color, Black, incarcerated in the U.S., that really sort of like, feeds into thinking about incarcerated people and capitalism. And sort of, again, I think the last live we talked about, right, the color line and being the labor line, sort of, again, getting to that in the 21st century. But so I'll say it's, again, really interesting that just 10 years later, I could have a class of students who, are like, oh, I haven't heard of this documentary, or, I don't know, or I haven't seen it. And so, I mean, I don't know if that speaks to how quickly things also trend out, right? Or even just like, we're seeing more discussions about changes in curriculum where, students aren't reading whole books. I'm shocked to see that sometimes students don't read whole books anymore, or maybe not many, or depending on how it feels like the more rigorous you get whole books, but less so, maybe not. And so again, it's sort of like, I think it makes it, even for college professors, and that's a whole other discussion, hard to really figure out where everyone's at, because everyone's at such different levels. Not that they weren't always at different levels, but I think even more so increasingly. But yeah, 13th, I think, really does sort of like parallel well with, Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. And, you really see a number of academics, right, in the documentary who are sort of like on the rise to be our next sort of like what another generation might have been called race men and women, but are kind of like, well-versed on these issues, right? Like Khalil Gibran Muhammad is in it. Michelle Alexander is in it. Van Jones is in it. A number of people, what's his name? Who is it called? Like Mercy or something? He's got the center, I think the Brennan Center. I'm sure that's part of his name. It'll come back to me. But I think it's interesting the way too that documentary kind of shows us like who are the people who are kind of top of the, Henry Louis Gates is in it, right? Who are the kind of Black scholars who are at the top of sort of African-American studies at the time? And so I wonder if there'll be a next generation of of 13th, right? With whoever's the next generation of Black scholars. I think that's also something to like think about.
Yeah, I think, okay, so that leads me in a different place. Yeah, I think that... Yes,
Just Mostly by Brian Stevenson is the right name. Thank you to that person.
Yeah, I think that when I think about the 13th, I want to say I was new in grad school, watched it, amazed by it. To your point about the scholars that were in it, I think it is time for the 13th. It is time for a new documentary. I think at that point, I don't believe that I was fully even understanding the presidency that we were in. We were in this current person's presidency, no, in 2015, right? Yeah.
2017 is when he started 45. Yeah.
2017 is when 45 came. And so I think putting it in that context and then getting us to a different presidency and then we're returning back. I think that there needs to be a conversation, even honestly, about the Black Lives Matter movement and how the sort of rise, and we're not going to say fall, but certainly decline of conversation, because let the internet tell it, there is no more police brutality. I don't see anyone hashtagging names, or I think I've seen a couple and they've gotten attention. But it almost felt like it just kind of disappeared. And I know there was a lot of sort of drama around it, and certainly we can digest the drama of it all, but I'm less interested in that and more interested in kind of this moment where we do need to have another conversation about what this looks like.
Right. I think movements are so hard to, I feel like organizing movements, all of these things are so difficult. And I think too, right, Michelle Alexander's point about the new Jim Crow, it's sort of like, it feels like we go through this cycle of like, you identify the problem, you make legislation, it changes into some other variation, right, and turns into mass incarceration and turns into something else. Maybe now it's going to be sort of like mass deportation and criminalization, what have you. There's an interesting nexus, I'll tell you, about crimigation. So, right, criminal justice reform and immigration. In particular, getting into my Haitian studies bag, right, the Haitian refugee crisis of like the 70s through to like, ongoing, but the 70s really thinking to about like the 1990s, where, I don't know if anyone remembers seeing, Haitian migrants on those like very weebly wobbly boats coming over and then, rejecting them. And part of the conflict was also that, Cubans could come over and that was okay because they were in a, communist country, but Haitians, since we were sort of cool with Haiti, it was not okay for them to come over. And so they said that they were economic migrants, or economic refugees, just looking for, better quality of life, even though really, they were fleeing a very violent dictatorship. Yeah. And so right around the time you're starting to have this flood of Haitian migrants coming over, that is actually when they start shifting to sort of like these mass deportations. Mm-hmm. So mass deportation sort of happens right around that same time that you have a lot of Haitians, fleeing and coming to the U.S. And so they start putting them, trying to, put them in barracks, putting them in Guantanamo Bay, really kind of like incarcerating them. Mm-hmm. And so really interesting to think about how those things like parallel, and the way that particularly in Florida, I've got an article that may never come out on this. So look at you guys. There's a way that the Black like Christian leadership in churches really said, Haitian migrants, this is a Black issue, right? This is a Black civil rights issue. We've really got to rally together to support them and to rally and to fight and, to kind of like see them as brothers and sisters who it is important to see. But now it feels like we're at a point where people are all like, more people are believing into like, immigrants are just taking from us narrative. And, again, sort of like deviating on those lines, there's sort of erasure of thinking about Black migrants who are affected. I think there's also, just because we have increasingly more Latinx population, people sort of only imagine them as Latinx. There's just so many discussions to be had about those different things and the way that they're kind of like assumptions are made and collapsed. And so again, that kind of the way that things are, shift and change, it becomes hard to organize. And there can be a question around like, is the move to secularization and away from faith part of what makes it hard to organize? You think about sort of like MLK, all of the leaders of, and I think I saw this somewhere recently, all the leaders of kind of like our 20th century, faith was a big part of that. Even, Malcolm X, right, on the other side, as sort of like, so again, that's something else to kind of think about is that need in faith, what is needed to kind of organize and not get kind of either sold into a kind of like capitalistic ideas
there we go.
Of becoming famous or like, I don't know, or just to kind of continue to, want to work towards something that is bigger than you and, may never serve you individually. Like, is faith what's needed? I don't know.
Yeah.
But certainly I think that's part of the question of thinking about like, why does it feel even harder to organize? I mean, of course, there's a number of reasons because capitalism has increased and everyone's so scattered and people don't all live in one ghetto anymore for the most part. But I think that's another aspect and factor to think about.
Yeah. So Dr. Barbara Savage writes a book called Your Spirit Walks Beside Us or Among Us. I can't remember Dr. Barbara Savage, but she writes about faith and the relationship with the civil rights movement. And she actually makes the argument that the civil rights movement being birthed in churches is a miracle because there was a turn towards secularization in that 1950s period. And that the fact that the church becomes kind of the center is shocking because most people really were not interested in the Black church at the time, right? And so it's really interesting to think about that because even now, like to your point, certainly people go to church. Dr. Barbara Savage wrote that book. But it made me think about this book, Race for Profit, where and it talks about how banks in the real estate industry undermine Black home ownership. So a lot of times when we talk about redlining when we talk about home ownership, but in this book they discuss how in 2008 part of the crash that impacts Black folks is that a large bank, I'm not going to say which one, was creating what they were calling in their private sort of spaces ghetto loans, which were subprime loans. They were targeting at Black churches, and they were giving these loans that they knew were going to go up in interest rate crazy. And it didn't matter what your credit score was. You were getting this loan, and then the church got a little bit of a kickback for it, right? And so they were sort of marketing, to your point about capitalism really being, I think, some of the ways that have impacted sort of even the the ways that people trust the church or trust faith systems. Because I know for me, at least, it was just shocking to know that it was in the 2000s and there was still sort of a marketing of that towards the Black church and even Black leaders going along with it. Race for Profit, really good book. Really good book. Yeah. Go ahead.
Say too, just very quickly, this is a book by Richard Rothstein. He is I think a white American author, but Color of Law really gives a great, like if you're looking to read more about the history of redlining, this is a good book to, look into for that. I think when I taught my African American literature course in grad school, I maybe sort of excerpted it, as well as this is also another sort of white American author, I believe, when affirmative action was white. I think that really gets into, right, we think about like the post World War II, right? Sort of like the social safety nets that were made for specifically white Americans and how they kind of cut Black Americans out through language about, this isn't for, domestic servants, right? And who's a domestic servant in the 50s and 60s? Mostly Black Americans, right? So those are just some other books I think that could be relevant or useful if people are interested that I have, sort of like excerpted for classes in the past.
Yeah, yeah. So I see you all
Yes.
have a lot to say, and you want us to make
Yes,
a
Ira
post.
Castleton is the
Yeah,
name.
sharing the recommendations. We will do that. The Warmth of Other Suns. Yes, that's a definite must read. And I want to say for those who are just getting into reading sort of academic books, one hack is one, these books have a lot of information, are packed with a lot of information. And so I often say you need to just read the introduction, sort of get an understanding of what the argument is being made, and then you'll also get an understanding of what each chapter is arguing. And so find the chapter that feels most salient to you at the time, and that's how you can kind of get through these books, be a part of the conversation, and not feel like, as you would need to do like with a fiction, with a novel, right? With fiction, with a novel, read through the whole thing. No, but
Right.
read the introduction, find a chapter, get some understanding, and you can have good conversation instead of getting, because I know it can be overwhelming when you look at these
Yeah.
books and you're like, I got to read all this. No, no, no. Just get into the conversation, right? Just enter into the conversation a little bit easier, okay? All right, y'all.
Right.
Well, I think we have had a wonderful discussion. Do we want to make this every Saturday thing? What do
Sure.
y'all think? What do y'all think? Every Saturday, maybe around noon. Was this time okay? Was this time okay? It was good. We want to make this a thing. Okay, awesome. So we will continue with this. And like I said, we'll be setting up our YouTube. I know some of you all said that you were having a hard time finding it. We'll get all that together, you guys. Work with us. We are working women. we are hard workers over here.
Right.
And so we're trying. And like I said, that first conversation over on YouTube, I think we're gonna get into Cowboy Carter. Is that what we were trying to do? Coming at it from
Yeah.
like a
Yeah.
diasporic perspective and a lot of different things. So thank you guys so much. Reading list, yes, I'll put that over on the YouTube channel, I think. And honestly, y'all, I'm gonna have to ask. We have so many books like swirling around, as you can see behind the rail. Okay, so many books.
This isn't even close to all of
That's
them.
it, right. So trying to like remember what we're saying sometimes can be a bit difficult. But like I said, we'll record this, or it's going to be recorded and put over there. All right, all right. Bye, y'all. Bye, bye, bye.
Bye.
Space at the center.
Thanks.